Welcome back to Go Sleepy, your quiet corner of YouTube where stories become dreams. Tonight, we return to the frozen north, to the ancient wall, and to the sworn brothers who guarded the realm for thousands of years. So find a warm blanket, settle into a cozy spot, and let your eyes grow heavy as we drift into the entire history of the Night's Watch, a calm, soothing lore journey told beneath soft campfire ambience. Breathe deeply, relax, and let the North guide you into sleep. Long before the wall rose like a frozen spine across the northern edge of the world, before crows wore black cloaks and whispered vows into the cold wind, there was only the quiet, endless North, a place of drifting snows, ancient forests, and long winter nights so deep that the sky itself seemed to be holding its breath. In these forgotten centuries, so distant they live only in whispers, the world was young, and the people of Westeros still walked cautiously beneath the gaze of old powers. It is here, in this stillness, that the story of the Night's Watch truly begins. The earliest tales speak of a time when men lived scattered across the land, huddled in small keeps and timber halls. Fires were precious, food was hunted and gathered, and winters stretched so long that memories of warmth felt like myths. The first men told stories to one another around crackling hearths, stories of strange shapes moving beyond the tree line, of glowing eyes watching from the snowdrifts, and of the distant, eerie silence that meant something inhuman was near. These tales were not entertainment. They were warnings. For beyond the far, far north, where the wind screamed across white plains and the sky shimmered with ghostly lights, the others stirred. Some say they were older than men, older than the forests, older than stone itself. They glided across the snow without leaving footprints, carrying cold with them like a cloak of frost. The first men did not yet know their name, but they learned their terror. And when the long night began, an endless winter where the sun vanished and shadows ruled the world, humanity learned that fear could wear a face of icy beauty. Villages vanished. Entire families froze beside their hearths. Those struck down by the others rose again in the moonlight, pale and silent, marching at the will of a cold intelligence that cared nothing for life. The long night stretched on, moon after moon, until even the bravest among men wondered whether dawn would ever return. It was in this darkness that a single leader emerged, though his name is lost in the drifting snows of legend. Some call him the last hero. Some say he was a Stark, others a man of the Dawn Age. Some whisper he carried a blade of steel kissed by fire. Others say he walked alone, desperate, with only a broken sword and a dying horse for company. But all the stories agree on one thing. He traveled north, farther than any man had dared, seeking the children of the forest. For they were the keepers of ancient magic, the only hope humanity had left. The journey was long, filled with cold, that could have frozen breath into shards. Wolves stalked him, shadows followed him, and the others haunted his trail like patient hunters. His companions, brave men sworn to stand beside him, fell one by one, some to the cold, some to hunger, some to the pale hands of the enemy, until at last the last hero walked alone. But still he pushed forward. Still he hoped. Still he believed dawn could return. The children of the forest answered his plea, though no one alive knows exactly how. Some say he knelt before their weirwood throne, beneath a heart tree glowing red against the snow, and they gifted him a weapon of dragon steel. Others claim he fought beside them in a battle shrouded in ice and moonlight. Whatever truth sleeps beneath the myth, the legends say that together, the children and the last hero, they found a way to push back the darkness, and slowly, painfully, the dawn returned. A pale, soft light at first, barely more than a promise, then a glow, then warmth. The long night ended. Humanity survived. But survival came with a lesson carved into the bones of the world. The others would return one day, and men needed a defense that would never sleep. It was after this that the first men, and perhaps the children, began a great work. A work so massive, so impossible, that only magic and desperation could have created it. Block by block, ice by ice, they began raising a barrier, taller than any tower, longer than any road. A wall not just of frozen water, but of spells older than language itself. The wall. Even in its earliest years, it stood like a frozen mountain, shimmering blue beneath winter skies, humming faintly with ancient wards. Men gathered at its feet, fighters, hunters, exiles, dreamers, and those who simply had nowhere else to go. They swore oaths under the cold moonlight, binding their lives to a single purpose: protect the realms of men. No wife, no children, no crowns, no lands, only the wall. These first guardians weren't yet called the Night's Watch. They were simply the Watchers, the few who refused to look away from the danger lurking in the far north. They built their first wooden keeps, crude and wind-beaten, clinging to the side of the wall like lonely sentinels. They patrolled with torches that sputtered in the icy wind, carrying spears tipped with dragon glass and hopes stronger than steel. Nights were long and quiet in those days, filled with only the soft cry of snow owls and the distant groan of shifting ice. But as the decades passed, their order grew. More keeps were built, towers rose, and the watch began to organize itself into something greater, something eternal. The brothers in black were still centuries away from their full formation, but the spirit of the watch was already alive in those first men who looked northward with wary eyes. For they knew what so many later forgot. The wall was not built to keep out wildlings. It was built to stand between the living and a cold, patient darkness that would one day return. And so, in the quiet glow of campfires flickering at the foot of the wall, the earliest watchers whispered their own stories, stories of the long night, of the last hero, of the pale shadows that glittered like shattered ice. Stories meant to remind them why they stood their lonely vigil, stories meant to keep the memory of danger alive. For memory is a kind of magic, and the watch was built on both. As the northern wind sighed through the pines and snow drifted down like slow, sleepy feathers, the first chapter of the Night's Watch began, not with grand armies or bright banners, but with weary eyes, cold hands, and a vow yet to be spoken. As years turned into decades and decades slipped quietly into centuries, the great wall of ice grew taller, thicker, and more formidable. Its surface glimmered softly beneath the moonlight, like a colossal frozen mirror reflecting the stars. Snow piled against its base in gentle drifts, and winds carrying secrets from the far north brushed along its length with a sighing whisper. But even more enduring than the wall itself were the men who kept watch upon it. men who shaped the earliest foundations of what would one day be known as the Night's Watch. These early guardians were wanderers, warriors, and weathered souls seeking purpose in a world slowly healing from the long night. Many came with heavy hearts, carrying burdens from their former lives, broken families, ruined fortunes, or regrets too deep to mend. Others came willingly, drawn to the haunting beauty of the North and the solemn promise of protecting the realm. And some came because they had nowhere else left to go. The wall welcomed them all. In those early days, the Watch was not yet bound by strict hierarchy or formal vows. But even without spoken ritual, a quiet understanding existed among the men. They were brothers now, tied not by blood, but by the cold and the duty they shared. Around their campfires, they carved new identities for themselves. Names whispered softly into the night as the flames danced. Brother, they called one another, even when they had met only hours before. Life was harsh, but strangely peaceful. They built rough barracks of pine logs, layered animal furs over their shoulders, and learned to read the songs of the wind. Days were filled with labor, hauling timber, digging trenches, reinforcing makeshift watch posts, sharpening spears, and exploring the land around them. Nights were reserved for keeping vigil. One man's eyes held open, while another slept lightly nearby. It was a rhythm carved by necessity, not yet by tradition. And slowly, the Watch transformed from a collection of wanderers into a true brotherhood. One figure of quiet respect in those days was a man named Sir Aragon Snow, though few now recall his name. Aragon had once been a sellsword who traveled far across Westeros, serving many lords, but belonging to none. When he came to the Wall after losing everyone he had ever loved to a cruel winter, he found something he never expected: peace. He taught the men how to train in formation, how to move as a unit, how to rely on each other's strengths. Under his guidance, patrols became more organized, defenses more formidable. Another was Tala of the Pines, a woman remembered only in fragments, but believed by some to be the first steward of the early Watch. Long before the order became exclusively male, legends say Tala arrived with her kin seeking refuge from raiders. She had an uncanny ability to ration food, organize supplies, and plan for harsh winters. Without her quiet wisdom, her careful counting of every grain, every log, and every drop of rendered fat, many believe the early Watch would not have survived its most desperate winters. Their contributions, though softened by time, shaped the first brothers. Around the growing settlement, what would centuries later become Castle Black, the Watchers built their first towers, crude wooden structures with narrow slits for archers. These towers creaked in the cold and groaned during storms, but each one shone warmly from within when a torch was lit. From these high places, men learned to scan the forests and frozen rivers, studying the distant horizon with patient, steady eyes. Every night, an eerie, beautiful glow filled the sky as the aurora shimmered above the wall. Bands of green, blue, and ghostly white rippled across the heavens, illuminating the ice with soft radiance. The brothers often paused to watch this display. It soothed their weary minds and reminded them that the world, even in its coldest corners, held quiet wonders. Though the others had not been seen for generations, the memory of the long night still clung to the land. The brothers kept dragon-glass daggers near their bunks, and they carved runes of protection into their shields, believing, perhaps irrationally, perhaps wisely, that these marks would keep the darkness at bay. Knowledge of the true enemy had faded into myth, but the instinct to prepare never left. Still, the greatest threat to the early watch was not an otherworldly foe, but the winter itself. The cold seeped into bones like an invisible weight. Fingers stiffened, beards froze solid, and breath turned to mist that clung to eyelashes. Hunting became scarce during deep winter, and even the toughest men found themselves weakened. Yet the brothers endured, leaning on one another for warmth, rations, and companionship. They sang songs, slow, deep chants that echoed around the fire, songs about the dawn returning, about brave men in ancient battles, and about the brothers who would stand together no matter how cold the winds blew. Stories became their lifeblood. Tala recorded their names in a simple leather-bound book, its pages now lost to history. She wanted their memory preserved, not for glory, but for acknowledgement. "We are small pieces," she would say softly, as snow tapped against the wooden shutters. But even small pieces make the wall strong. As their numbers grew, so did the need for structure. Aragon proposed dividing the brothers into 3 groups, each with unique responsibilities. The rangers, who ventured into the haunted forests beyond the wall. The builders, who tended to the ever-growing structure of ice and stone. The stewards, who kept the order functioning, cooking, tending animals, crafting weapons, and managing supplies. This division wasn't yet formalized, but the seeds were planted. The watch was learning to shape itself into something that could last. And in the midst of this slow evolution, the brothers noticed a quiet truth. Though they came from different lives, they shared a peace here they had never found elsewhere. The wall was cold, yes, but it was also a kind of sanctuary, a place where past wrongs faded into snowflakes carried away on the wind. A place where a man could start again, cleansed by frost and silence. On certain clear nights, the brothers would climb the steps carved into the side of the wall. They would stand atop the immense ice ridge, their cloaks whipping in the wind, gazing into the infinite moonlit north. There was loneliness up there, yes, but also serenity, a quiet that settled the mind, like falling snow. It was in these moments, when the vastness of the world surrounded them, that the early brothers began to whisper ideas of a formal vow, a promise that would bind them together, a pledge that would outlive every man who spoke it. For though they were not kings or lords, and though their lives were harsh and unseen, they knew one truth. The wall needed them. And so, beneath the shimmering aurora and the eternal snow, the foundations of the true night's watch were set, not with swords, but with brotherhood. The wall stood silent and immense, its icy surface glowing faintly under the pale sweep of the moon. Winter winds curled around its edges like slow, whispering spirits, carrying the scent of pine, frost, and the distant secrets of the far north. The early brothers who lived at its base felt a quiet shift in the air, something subtle, like the world itself holding its breath. For though seasons passed, though decades slipped by in gentle layers of snow and memory, the watch was evolving, and now it was ready for its first true vow. It began on a night colder than most, the kind of cold that stung the lungs and turned torch flames into small, flickering ghosts. A sky of stars stretched above like glittering ice caught in the heavens, and the aurora shimmered faintly along the horizon, painting soft greens and blues across the dark. The brothers sat around a wide fire built in the center of their camp, still a humble place of pine huts and rough towers, but warm with life. Aragon Snow stood quietly near the flames, his breath a soft mist in the air. His hair, once dark, had begun to frost with age, but his eyes still held a spark that spoke of unbroken purpose. Tala of the Pines sat with her quill and leather-bound book, her face calm as she listened to the brothers murmur among themselves. Something sacred was stirring, an idea born not from a single mind, but from the hearts of them all. They had built the towers. They had carved paths along the wall. They had weathered storms and shared quiet meals, leaning on each other through bitter nights. But they needed something more, something that would bind each new brother to the same duty that had kept these first guardians strong. Aragon stepped forward into the firelight, lifting his gaze to the men gathered around him. The flames cast warm shadows across the snow, and for a moment it seemed the entire world hushed to listen. "We stand here," he said softly, "because we have chosen to stand between the realm of men and whatever lies beyond this wall. Each of us came from a different life, some rich, some poor, some noble, some shamed, some lost, some wandering. But here we are the same." The brothers listened, their breaths rising like smoke toward the starry sky. "We are not kings," he continued. "We have no crowns. We ask for no reward. Our purpose is simple: to hold the line, to remember the darkness that nearly swallowed the world, to stand watch, not for glory, but for those who sleep safely to the south." There was a long, gentle silence. Even the fire softened its crackling, as if leaning in. Tala lifted her gaze. "And what binds us to this purpose?" she asked. "If winter grows cold and men grow weary, how will we keep our hearts strong?" Aragon looked at the wall, towering like a frozen god behind them. "With a vow," he said. "A vow that no man can break without breaking himself." The men murmured softly. Some nodded. Some pressed hands to the hilts of their dragon-glass blades, and though no one spoke the words yet, they all felt it, an invisible thread weaving them together. As the fire warmed their faces and the snow glittered around them, Aragon spoke the first shape of the vow that would one day become legendary. "I pledge my life to this watch," he said, his voice low and steady. "I will stand for the realm of men until my last breath. I will take no crown, no wife, no children. My life is the walls. My brothers are my blood." The words were simple then, softer and shorter than they would become in later ages, but they trembled with purpose, like the first heartbeat of something eternal. One by one the brothers rose. A fisherman from White Knife, his hands rough from nets and cold tides, placed his palm over his heart and repeated the vow. A former sellsword, still haunted by ghosts of the battles he fought, whispered the words with a trembling voice. A young man from a minor keep, barely more than a boy, spoke with quiet pride as he joined the brotherhood. Even Tala, though she would later leave the order when tradition hardened against women, placed her hand upon the book and said, "I share this vow in spirit, if not in name." When the last voice faded into the still night, silence wrapped around them like a cloak. The wind sighed through the trees. Snow drifted gently from the dark sky. It felt as though the world had acknowledged their promise. Aragon turned and looked toward the wall. "We will train those who come after us," he said. "We will teach them what the long night took from the world. We will build more keeps, raise stronger towers, and carve deeper steps into the ice. And one day, the watch will stand unbroken." His words brushed softly against the cold air, like an oath layered on top of their own. In the following weeks, the brothers carefully shaped the vow, adding lines that spoke of service, brotherhood, and sacrifice. The vow changed from a whisper into a ritual. New brothers stood beneath the shadow of the wall, torches held high, voices steady as they pledged themselves to a cause larger than any single man. Aragon and Tala wrote these words into the book, their ink freezing slightly at the edges on bitter nights. Each vow added another thread to the tapestry of the watch's future. As structures grew around their settlement, more solid walls, better stables, new barracks, the watch began to resemble the great order it would one day become. The brothers practiced with spear and bow, patrolled the lands beyond the wall, and taught new recruits how to live, fight, and survive in the harsh north. But the vow did something deeper, something more important than training or building. It gave them purpose. It gave them unity. It gave them identity. For the first time, the watch felt like a force that could outlast generations. Years later, those who had been there on that first night, the night the vow was spoken into the cold air, would tell the story in soft voices as snow fell outside their barracks. They spoke of the fire, of the shimmering aurora, of Aragon's steady voice, and of the moment when a group of wanderers became something greater. They became protectors. They became brothers. They became the night's watch. And though the wall was immense, ancient, and powerful, many believed the true strength of the watch began not with ice, but with that first shared promise whispered beneath the stars. The wall had already stood for centuries, shimmering like a frozen titan beneath the northern sky, when the night's watch began its slow transformation into a true order of men. What had begun as scattered wanderers and weary survivors now carried a shared vow, simple, solemn, and powerful. And with that vow, the watch deepened its roots, sending them far into both the icy ground and the hearts of the men who served. Seasons passed, each winter a little longer than the last, each summer a brief exhale of warmth before the cold reclaimed the land. Yet the brothers endured, bound not by blood, but by duty. When storms swept down from the far north, howling winds that rattled wooden shutters and pounded frost against the towers, the watch stood firm. When quiet nights settled softly over the wall, with torchlight flickering along its base like tiny stars, the brothers walked their rounds with steady steps. Their order was growing. The early settlement at the foot of the wall, once just a cluster of pine huts and makeshift shelters, began to transform. The men worked tirelessly with axe and hammer, replacing wood with stone, strengthening foundations, building long halls where they could train, eat, and rest. Smoke from their fires curled gently into the cold air, carrying the scent of cooking stews and burning logs. The camp slowly became a home, though a harsh one. Life was difficult, but there was a strange comfort in its rhythm. At dawn, the brothers gathered in the training yard, Their breath rose in soft white clouds as they practiced with spear, bow, and blade. Aragon Snow, though aging, still guided the younger men with calm confidence. He corrected their stances, taught them where to strike, and, more importantly, when not to strike. "A ranger survives not by strength," he often murmured, "but by knowing the land, knowing the cold, and knowing when to listen." By midday, patrols were formed. Some brothers ventured south to gather supplies from small nearby villages, their black cloaks billowing like shadows behind them. Others traveled north, past the sparse trees and frost-covered rivers, into the haunted wilderness few dared explore. These journeys were cautious, respectful, and quiet, much like the men who made them. Beyond the wall, the forests stretched endlessly, ancient and untouched. Snow muffled every sound except the occasional groan of frozen branches or the distant call of a lonely raven. Here, rangers learned to track movement in the snow, to map paths through the trees, and to recognize signs that the wild held dangers other than the cold. The free folk, those who would later be called wildlings, lived scattered across these remote lands. In the early centuries, their relationship with the Watch was not one of hostility, but of wary distance. Encounters were rare and often silent. A face glimpsed between trees, a campfire spotted far off on a ridge, footprints leading away into the drifting snow. No battles, no claims over land, only two peoples surviving in the same harsh, unforgiving world. Yet every ranger returned to the wall with the same quiet truth. The North was vast, wild, and mysterious, and the Watch needed deeper knowledge to endure it. This realization led the brothers to formalize their roles more clearly. Those who walked beyond the wall, the strongest, the most perceptive, the ones who could endure nights alone in the frozen wild, became rangers. They were the eyes of the Watch, learning the land so the Order could understand and defend against what lay beyond. Those who worked tirelessly with axe, rope, and stone were gathered into the builders, strengthening fortifications, repairing towers, carving new steps into the wall, and improving everything the Watch relied upon. And those whose hands were skilled in craft, care, and stewardship, those who cooked the meals, tended the wounded, kept the ravens, and maintained supplies, became the stewards, the quiet heartbeat of the Order. This structure, once only an idea, now took full shape. Tala of the Pines, who would later leave her mark only in faded stories, trained the stewards carefully before departing the Watch. Her influence lingered, though time would hide her name. She taught them to keep precise ledgers, to ration food for the harshest winters, and to maintain calm even when storms raged. From Aragon's teachings, the Rangers inherited discipline, patience, and the art of silent travel. And from the builders, men who worked with calloused hands and sore muscles, the wall itself gained strength. As the Order grew, so did its numbers. Word spread from village to village, from one small hall to another, that the Watch was seeking men. Some came willingly, second sons without inheritance, wanderers searching for purpose, men too proud to beg yet too poor to survive alone. Others came by force, criminals sentenced to the wall instead of the executioner's sword. These unwilling brothers arrived bitter and cold. But in time many found a strange refuge in the simplicity of their new life. For at the wall, a man's past mattered little. Once the black cloak settled across his shoulders, he was reborn. His mistakes were carried away by the wind, buried beneath the snow. His name was spoken with respect, brother, and his place in the world gained meaning. Still, not all who joined stayed. Some fled south, unable to endure the cold or the loneliness. These deserters were rare but dangerous. They weakened morale and threatened the order's unity. The watch refined its rules. Punishments grew harsher. Loyalty, once an expectation, became a law. With these changes, the watch began sending out ravens to keep contact with the small keeps farther south. Messages flew back and forth. Reports of weather, sightings of free folk, and requests for supplies. The ravens became lifelines, dark wings cutting through the frozen sky. In time, the watch expanded its presence along the wall. Keeps were built at intervals, small forts made of stone and timber, each one housing a handful of brothers. Among them, 3 began to rise above the rest. Castle Black in the center, East Watch by the sea on the frozen coast, and the Shadow Tower at the far western end. These became the anchors of the watch's defense, the places where new recruits were trained and where commanders gathered to make decisions. Still, through all this growth and change, the old stories were never forgotten. Each winter night, when the aurora rippled softly over the wall, the brothers sat near their fire and listened to the elders speak. They told tales of the long night, of the last hero, of battles fought in a world before memory. The stories were reminders, not of fear, but of purpose. For the watch did not exist for the free folk. It existed for what might one day stir in the shadows beyond the frozen wild. The others had not been seen for centuries, yet the old dread lingered. The vow, spoken softly into the cold air, held them steady. And so, as the centuries unfolded, the night's watch, once a handful of wanderers clinging to the base of a frozen wall, became a true brotherhood united beneath the endless sky, standing watch, while the world to the south slept deeply and peacefully, unaware of the quiet strength guarding its dreams. The centuries that followed were kind to the night's watch, kinder than any era before or after. As Westeros rebuilt itself after the long night, kingdoms rose, trade flourished, and peace settled like a warm blanket across the land. In these brighter ages, when memory of true darkness faded into legend, the watch reached its greatest strength. It began slowly, like the quiet growth of a tree taking root. Kings in the north, proud of their ancestors who had helped forge the wall, offered generous support. Grain, timber, wool, and steel flowed north along frost-covered roads. The kingdoms farther south, though more distant and less touched by winter, also sent aid. Some gave supplies, some gave coin, and some, usually those wishing to show honor or earn the gods' favor, sent their own sons. These high-born youths arrived at the wall with warm cloaks, polished armor, and the confidence of those who had known comfort all their lives. But the wall humbled every one. Whether noble or commoner, rich or poor, every man felt the same sting as the wind bit through his cloak, the same ache in his hands as he learned to wield a heavy spear, the same bone-deep exhaustion after a night of icy patrol. For the wall leveled all men, and because of this, the watch grew stronger. By this time, Castle Black was a thriving stronghold, humming with life even in the heart of winter. The great hall held long tables built from dark, sturdy pine. Its fires glowed day and night. The armory brimmed with sharpened weapons. The stables were full, the forges hot, and the sound of training echoed through the cold air like a heartbeat. The stewards kept everything running smoothly, led by a long line of careful, sharp-minded officers who followed the quiet wisdom of Tala the Pines. Even though her name had long since softened into myth, they rationed food with precision, tended the ravens, and ensured no brother went hungry. It was said that a steward could turn a single winter onion into a feast if needed, and oftentimes that legend didn't feel far from the truth. The builders were tireless, expanding the wall's structures far beyond what the first brothers had imagined. They reinforced the towers, strengthened the gates, and cut deep stairways into the ice. They created warm spaces for the horses, storage vaults for dragon glass, and small, stone-lined chambers where patrols could find shelter during blizzards. Their work never ended, for ice shifts like a living thing, but their devotion kept the wall solid and unyielding. And the Rangers, they became the pride of the order. Tall, lean, and fearless, the Rangers walked farther north than any who had come before. They learned the patterns of the seasons, the migration of herds, the signs of approaching storms. They mapped frozen rivers, discovered hidden valleys, and established safe paths through the dense forests. Their presence stretched deep into the wild, giving the watch eyes far beyond the horizon. During this age of strength, the free folk and the watch rarely clashed. They traded on occasion, furs for steel, herbs for salt. They shared uneasy respect, knowing that each lived in the shadow of the same immense, indifferent north. Though small skirmishes erupted now and then, they were no more than sparks in a long winter, signs of survival, not war. And throughout all this growth, the vow remained the heart of the order. Each new recruit, whether a king's youngest son or a low-born farmer's orphan, knelt beneath the wall to swear the oath. Their voices, steady and solemn, echoed against the ancient ice. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. The words carried power now, shaped through generations. Every man who spoke them felt himself become part of something eternal, something larger than his name, his blood, or his past. The watch thrived not because of strength alone, but because of belief. Soon, the order reached heights that future generations would only dream of. 10,000 men wore black. 10,000 men patrolled the wall, trained in its yards, slept in its halls, and watched the northern wilderness with patient, steady eyes. At night, Castle Black glowed with hundreds of torches, the light shimmering on the snow like scattered stars. The sound of laughter drifted from the kitchens, mingling with the soft bleating of goats and the rhythmic hammering of the forges. Even the cold felt gentler in those days, for it was shared. During long winter evenings, the brothers gathered for tales, stories told by firelight, their voices weaving warmth into the icy air. They spoke of the first men, of the ancient children of the forest, of the long night, and of heroes who stood against shadows. These stories, half truth and half legend, bound the brothers together. They were reminders of why the wall existed and why the vow mattered. Some nights, elders spoke of the others. Their tales were quiet, spoken with respectful fear. Not because the brothers had seen them, many believed the others were gone forever, but because the stories served as warnings. The wall is not for men, Oregon Snow once said, though few remembered the words came from him. It is for what waits when memory grows weak. But in the Golden Age, memory did grow weak. Generations passed with no sign of the icy enemy. Winters came and went without unnatural dread. The rangers found no pale shadows lurking in the trees, and so, slowly, belief in the ancient danger faded. Some brothers scoffed at the old tales, others shrugged them off as children's stories. Yet the vow persisted. Even if forgotten fears softened, duty remained firm. There was peace, too, within the watch itself. Leadership passed from hand to hand without bloodshed. The Lord Commanders of this era were men of steady wisdom, respected by all. They guided the watch with fairness, teaching every new brother the value of unity. Under their rule, the watch remained whole, unbroken, and admired. Kings journeyed to the wall to show honor. Lords sent their sons as gestures of loyalty. Even the small folk in distant villages spoke of the watch with reverence, for they believed the black-cloaked brothers stood as a shield between the living and whatever mystery stirred beyond the frozen north. And so, decade by decade, century by century, the Night's Watch reached its height. But beneath every golden age lies the first subtle tremor of decline, soft as the sigh of wind across the snow, quiet as frost forming along the edges of a window pane. A tremor so faint that none notice it until it grows too large to silence. At the wall, that tremor had already begun. The brothers of the watch did not yet feel it. They still stood strong. They still watched faithfully, but the world was changing, slowly and quietly, like a winter creeping forward day by day. And soon, the watch's long descent would begin. In the quiet years that followed the watch's golden age, a subtle shift passed through Westeros, so gentle, so gradual, that those who lived through it barely noticed until it was too late. Years of peace brought comfort, and comfort brought forgetfulness. The shadows of the long night faded deeper into story, deeper into myth, until even the most devoted brothers wondered whether the tales of icy demons and undead armies had been nothing more than old men's imaginings. It began not with war or famine or tragedy, but with something far simpler, the slow turning of men's hearts away from the wall. As kingdoms grew comfortable and prosperous, the north became less central to their thoughts. Lords to the south, bathed in warm sun and soft breezes, found it increasingly difficult to imagine the cold, haunted wilderness their ancestors once feared. The wall stands strong, they said. The Night's Watch is mighty. Why worry over legends? Support dwindled. Grain shipments became smaller. Coin that once flowed generously began to trickle. And the sons of noble houses, who had once ridden proudly north to swear their vows, now found excuses to stay home. One lord claimed his son was too young, another too valuable, another the last heir of his line. Eventually, fewer and fewer high-born men made the journey north. Their absence, though small at first, would echo through the centuries, like a faint bell tolling in the distance. The watch, though still strong, felt the change. At Castle Black, the great hall no longer hummed with the vibrant mix of noble chatter and rough northern laughter. Fewer cloaks lined the pegs by the door. Fewer recruits shared steaming bowls of stew in the winter evenings. And fewer voices rose in song, recounting the ancient victories that had once defined their identity. Yet the brotherhood endured. They always endured, but endurance came at a cost. The Rangers were the first to feel the strain. Their long patrols beyond the wall grew quieter, lonelier. Fewer men meant fewer rotations, and fewer rotations meant exhaustion. Rangers who once roamed the north with confidence now traveled in pairs instead of groups, their eyes sharp and tired as they navigated the snow-laden forests. Sometimes they found abandoned wildling camps, empty circles of crushed snow around cold fire pits. Sometimes they found tracks leading north, deeper into lands they rarely dared explore. Occasionally they encountered small wildling clans, lean and determined, pushing south in search of better land. These encounters were tense but brief. Both sides wanted survival, not conflict. But there were stranger signs too. Tracks that vanished abruptly, as though the wind had swept them away too quickly. Small animals found frozen mid-stride, as if winter had kissed them suddenly. And once, a ranger returned pale and shaken, claiming he had heard whispers in the trees, soft, distant murmurs that rose and fell like breathing. The watch dismissed it as exhaustion, but the ranger never slept comfortably again. Beyond the wall, the land was not empty. It was changing. Meanwhile, within the watch itself, other cracks formed. Deserters became more common, though still rare. A man weary of cold and hardship would slip away into the night, heading south toward warmer lands. Some believed they could outrun their vow. Few succeeded. And those who did vanish left a quiet ache behind, as though the order itself felt each betrayal like a wound. Leadership, too, grew more complicated. The early Lord Commanders had been men shaped by duty, discipline, and unwavering purpose. But as fewer high-born men joined, fewer leaders trained in the arts of governance remained. The Watch still elected its commanders through tradition and brotherly choice, but the choices grew narrower. Sometimes wise men rose, sometimes proud men, sometimes men who had never expected leadership at all. Still, the Watch remained vigilant. Still, they held the wall. It was during this era that East Watch by the Sea began to take prominence. The icy coastline, with its frozen waves and distant gull calls, became a major entry point for small trading ships. Fishermen from the North Sea brought salted fish and news of passing storms. Once or twice, ships from Bravos or Pentos drifted in, their sailors wrapped in heavy cloaks, curious about the great wall of ice. These encounters were peaceful, but they brought with them a reminder the Watch did not wish to acknowledge. Westeros was growing larger. The wall was growing smaller. Yet the greatest shift came not from outside the order, but from within. A quiet change in the brothers themselves. Where once men joined seeking purpose, many now came seeking escape. Escape from justice, escape from poverty, escape from mistakes made in drunkenness or desperation. These men were not weak, but they lacked the conviction the old vow demanded. Some found purpose within the Watch's walls. Others kept their bitterness buried beneath their black cloaks, festering like old wounds. At night the fires still burned. The stories were still told, but the voices telling them had changed. Some spoke with reverence, others with weariness. And some, those too young to remember the Watch's strongest days, spoke with disbelief. "You believe in shadows," one recruit once murmured to an older brother. "I believe in vows," the old man replied. But it was a vow harder to uphold now than ever before. Even the wall itself seemed to sense the shift. In deep winter, The ice groaned more loudly, cracking in long, echoing sighs that drifted across the snow like distant thunder. Some said the wall was speaking. Others said it was warning. But most simply pulled their cloaks tighter and tried to sleep. And so, the watch continued its long, slow descent. Not a fall, not a collapse, just a quiet settling of frost over faith, duty, and memory, one thin layer at a time. Yet even in this subtle decline, something remained unbroken, something strong, something waiting. On nights when the aurora rippled across the sky, casting ghostly colors on the ice, some brothers, especially the older ones, felt a strange stirring in their hearts, a reminder that the watch existed for a reason older than any of them, a reason the world had forgotten, a reason the darkness had not. The night's watch still stood, but soon it would face trials unlike any seen since the long night. And the wall, ancient and patient, watched silently as cracks formed in both ice and men. Centuries drifted by like falling snow, settling quietly over the memory of Westeros. What once had been clear, urgent truths faded into softened stories told by firelight. Gentle, distant things that no longer stirred the heart with fear. The golden age of the night's watch slipped into the past like a bright sunset swallowed by winter dusk. And in that growing twilight, the watch began to shrink. Not all at once. Not in thunder or blood, but in silence. The realms of men grew busy with their own quarrels. Kingdoms fought and reconciled, traded and schemed, rose and fell, all beneath warm southern skies untouched by northern frost. Kings turned their eyes toward thrones, taxes, and banners. Wars were fought over pride, inheritance, and marriage alliances, not ancient terrors that had slept so long they seemed like myths. The farther south one traveled, the more the wall became a tale mothers told children to remind them of the world's vastness. Far in the north, they whispered, there is a wall of ice taller than mountains, and black-cloaked brothers stand watch upon it. But their voices held no fear, only wonder, only distance. And distance, more than anything, is what weakened the watch. At Castle Black, the halls that once rang with laughter, training, and fellowship now echoed with emptiness. Bowls no longer clattered in great numbers at mealtime. Fewer cloaks hung near the doors. Fewer fires were needed to warm the gathering spaces. The watch still worked, trained, and patrolled, but the life that once filled its courtyards flickered like a candle struggling against the cold. When recruits arrived now, they often came in shackles. Some were thieves given a choice, the wall or the noose. Some were men who fought the wrong lord at the wrong time. Some were cowards who ran from battle. Some were simply hungry souls who had taken a loaf of bread at the wrong moment. The watch accepted them all. It had no choice. Lord commanders did what they could, shaping broken men into something capable, disciplined, and useful. But even the strongest leader cannot turn every bitter heart into devotion. The watch was no longer a brotherhood chosen. It had become a brotherhood of necessity. Still, the vow remained. On cold nights, new recruits knelt beneath the towering blue glow of the wall, its frozen surface reflecting torchlight like trapped stars. Even those who wished they were anywhere else felt a shiver of awe as they placed their hands upon the cold earth and repeated the ancient words, "Night gathers, and now my watch begins." The vow was the thread that held everything together. Even when frayed, even when weary, it did not break. The rangers who remained carried out their duties with quiet resilience. They still rode beyond the wall, navigating the white wilderness with vigilance. But their numbers were fewer. Their training rushed, their supplies scarce. The deep forests seemed darker than before, the winds colder, the nights longer. Sometimes a ranger patrol would return with news of wildlings gathering in larger numbers, bands uniting into tribes, tribes into migrations. When asked why, the answer was always the same. Winter is harder, they would say. Something is driving them south, but no one understood what that something was. Not yet. Across the wall, life changed too. The free folk endured harsh seasons, harder than any in living memory. Their hunters returned with frostbitten hands. Their elders whispered of unusual stillness in the far icy places, places even they feared to roam. Some claimed they had seen shadows moving in the distant snows. Some swore they felt watched while crossing the frozen rivers. But when asked by the watch for details, their stories turned vague, fragile, like faint dreams dissolving at dawn. Still, the men of the watch wrote down every tale, for even broken stories hold truth. Within the watch itself, the Lord Commanders struggled to keep unity. Rivalries grew between officers. Disputes over dwindling resources sparked arguments. Leadership changed hands more frequently, sometimes through election, sometimes through quiet manipulation. And beneath the surface of it all lay a single, undeniable truth. The watch remembered its purpose. The world no longer believed in it. One harsh winter, a winter so long and deep that even the elders shuddered at its cold, Castle Black felt the full weight of decline. The stores of grain ran low. The goats in the stables grew thin. Men huddled in their barracks, their breath freezing in the air. Some wondered aloud whether this was just another winter, or something else. On one of those nights, as the aurora glimmered faintly overhead, an older brother named Sir Jaron Marsh spoke softly to a group of younger men who could not sleep. He poked at the fire with a stick, the embers glowing like red jewels. "You think the wall stands for wildlings?" he asked gently. The young men said nothing. Jaron smiled sadly. "No. The wall is older than their tribes, older than all our banners, older even than the kingdoms men fight their silly wars over." The others leaned in, listening. "The wall was built because the darkness once came," he whispered. "It walked on two legs, and it froze the world." He looked each of them in the eyes. "The watch was made to remember what the world wants to forget." Outside, a cold wind pressed against the shutters, moaning softly like a restless spirit. Most of the young brothers dismissed Jaron's tale as just another fireside story, but a few felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Meanwhile, far north of the wall, something ancient stirred, very faintly, very quietly, like a long-buried memory waking from sleep. Shadows lengthened across the snow. Frost clung thicker to branches. The night air grew sharper, heavier, almost watchful. And though no man at Castle Black could yet see it, the world was slowly turning toward a new beginning. A beginning shaped by ancient powers the watch had nearly forgotten. The brothers still kept their vows. They still held their posts. They still watched the endless northern horizon. But soon that horizon would watch them back. The winter deepened, settling over the land like a heavy white blanket that refused to lift. Snow layered upon snow, smoothing the rugged shapes of the forest into gentle hills, softening the hard lines of the wall until it seemed more dream than fortress. The wind, once merely cold, now carried a strange sharpness, an edge that pricked at the skin and lingered in the lungs. Those who had served in the night's watch long enough knew the north well. They had learned to read the sky, to feel the pulse of winter, to sense the shift of seasons even before the animals did. But this winter was different. The air felt older, still, listening. Something had awakened beyond the wall. It began quietly, as changes often do. A raven, one of the oldest in the rookery, refused to eat. It sat stiffly on its perch. Black feathers bristled, eyes glassy as if watching something distant. No illness could be found, and yet the bird would not sleep. It simply stared northward, its beak slightly parted, as though waiting for a sound only it could hear. Then came the reports from the rangers. A patrol returned early one morning, their cloaks stiff with frozen sweat, their faces pale beneath the flickering torchlight of the gatehouse. They had found a wildling village, one known to trade peacefully with the watch on harsh winters, abandoned, completely empty. Not a body, not a footprint, not even the usual scatter of tools left behind when a village moved quickly. Only silence and ice. The cook fires had been extinguished mid-meal. Tools lay frozen to the ground. A single child's toy, carved from bone, sat upright in the snow, untouched by wind. It was as though the villagers had simply vanished. The watch took note, whispering among themselves in low voices. Wildlings flee all the time, some said, moving south for food. But others shook their heads. No tracks, they insisted. No signs of movement. Nothing alive or dead, only cold. As days slipped into weeks, more strange signs appeared. A herd of elk was found lying together in a silent ring, their bodies unmarked, their eyes frozen open. A river farther north, one that rarely froze completely, had turned to solid ice overnight. And the rangers reported an eerie stillness in the forests, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The animals moved strangely, if they moved at all. The wind carried faint, distant whispers that vanished when approached. And sometimes, just sometimes, the night sky glimmered with unnatural colors, blue-white veils rippling silently across the horizon. At Castle Black, the older brothers grew uneasy. Sir Jaron Marsh, who had spoken often of forgotten legends, began to sleep less. He spent long hours atop the wall, scanning the north with tired, watchful eyes. Some nights he stood unmoving for so long that frost gathered on his cloak like snowfall. Others grew restless too. One stormy night, a young recruit named Arlen woke screaming. The brothers rushed to him, shaking his shoulders until he blinked awake. He spoke of a dream, of pale shapes gliding between trees, of eyes like shards of blue ice watching from the darkness, of cold hands reaching for him. His voice trembled as he described the sound they made, a soft, brittle crackling like breaking glass beneath snow. The older brothers exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard such descriptions before, in stories told by firelight. Stories most men no longer believed. Still, the watch carried on. Men trained in the yard, their breaths rising in white clouds. Builders reinforced the gates with extra planks, muttering that the wood felt weaker in the cold. Stewards kept the fires burning through long nights. But beneath the routine, beneath the vow and discipline, a quiet fear settled into the stone and the snow. One morning, just before dawn, a ranger staggered through the gate with no companions beside him. His cloak was torn, his face ghost pale, his lips blue despite the fires the brothers rushed to light around him. They wrapped him in furs, pressed warm broth to his trembling hands, and waited for his voice to return. When at last he spoke, his voice came out small and whispery, like wind sliding over ice. "We were 6, he said. 6 when we crossed the frost fangs. 6 when we found the camp." He paused, eyes unfocused. "The wildlings, they did not run. They did not fight. They were, I don't know the word, just standing, all of them, as if frozen in place. Their eyes..." He choked, shaking. The brothers exchanged glances. "What happened to your companions?" someone asked gently. The ranger swallowed hard. "They stayed to look closer," he said, "to check if any lived. I stepped back. The cold..." His voice faltered. "Not winter cold, something worse. It was like breathing in knives. Like the cold wanted to take something from me." He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, as if still feeling it. "And then," he whispered, "I heard them." "Hear what?" Jaren asked softly. The ranger's face tightened. "Whispers," he breathed. "Voices in the snow, and footsteps. No, not footsteps. Something sliding, moving fast. Too fast." The hall went completely silent. "I ran," he said, tears freezing on his lashes. "I ran without looking back." Water dripped from the melting snow on his cloak, each drop echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet hall. Not long after his return, the aurora appeared again. But this time, its colors were wrong. The usual green and soft blue were streaked with a cold, piercing white that pulsed slowly, like the breath of some distant, unseen thing. The brothers stood along the wall, watching the sky light up in unnatural shades. The colors reflected in their eyes, beautiful, eerie, unsettling. "Winter is shifting," Jaren murmured. "No," another brother whispered. "Something else is." Beyond the wall, the forests and frozen rivers waited. The shadows deepened, the nights grew still, and though the watch did not yet know the shape of what stirred, they felt it, in the air, in the snow, in the silence between heartbeats. Something was coming, something old, something cold, and the wall, ancient, patient, mighty, stood like a silent sentinel between that rising darkness and the realms of men. For now, the night the first true sign appeared, Castle Black lay wrapped in deep silence. Snow drifted softly from a starless sky, settling in thick layers along the walls, on rooftops, and across the training yard where no footprints marred the white. Even the ravens seemed uneasy, rustling restlessly in their cages, as though trying to speak yet unable to find their voices. In the darkest hour before dawn, a horn sounded from atop the wall. One long note, low, trembling, echoing across the frozen wilderness. Not the call for rangers returning, not the call for wildlings approaching. One note, a warning, a message older than memory. Jaren Marsh, awakened by the sound, moved quickly through the courtyard, boots crunching in fresh snow. Other brothers emerged from their barracks, cloaks drawn tight, breaths clouding the air. The horn was rarely used now. Its voice was part of a forgotten language, yet its meaning, once learned, never truly left a man's bones. Something moved in the north. Jaren ascended the long wooden steps carved into the wall, each plank creaking under his weight. When he reached the top, the sight stole his breath, not with terror, but with a quiet, soul-deep dread. A pale mist coiled along the ground beyond the wall, rolling in slow, serpentine waves. It glowed faintly with a bluish sheen, as though lit from within. The forest that had stood dark and tangled for centuries looked strangely blurred behind the mist, its shapes distorted like reflections in rippling water. The ranger who had sounded the horn stood stiffly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "What did you see?" Jaren asked, voice hushed despite the wind. The young ranger swallowed. "Not a man," he whispered. "Not a beast. Something else. Something wrong." Jaren placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tell me." "It moved through the trees like a shadow of cold," the ranger said. "No sound, no footprints, and its eyes." He shivered. Blue, like ice lit from within. Jaren inhaled sharply. He had heard such descriptions only in stories told by elders whose voices trembled with age, stories of the others, stories most men now dismissed as myth. But myths do not walk, and the ranger's fear was real. The mist thickened, pressing closer to the wall's base, curling around the trunks of trees like soft smoke. The brothers stared into the distance, trying to pierce the shifting whiteness. Then, faintly, softly, a sound drifted to them. A brittle crackling, like thin ice splintering under gentle pressure. A whisper of movement, not wind, not animal, something alive or no longer alive. A shadow slipped through the mist, tall, graceful, silent. It glided rather than walked, its shape almost human but wrong in every quiet, terrible way. The faint light of the aurora washed across its pale form, revealing a face that was smooth, sharp-featured, and carved with ice. Its eyes caught the light. Blue fire, cold intelligence, ancient hunger. The ranger by Jaren's side sucked in a breath, the sound breaking the spell-binding silence. The creature's head tilted ever so slightly, as though sensing the breath itself. Jaren stepped forward, gripping the icy railing. "It's watching us," he whispered. And indeed the creature stood still, staring up at the great wall of ice. It did not move. It did not blink. It simply observed, as if measuring the wall, testing its presence after thousands of years. And the wall, the mighty, protective, towering barrier forged in the earliest days of fear, seemed to hum with old magic in response. Its icy surface rippled faintly under the aurora, as though remembering why it had been built. Minutes passed, long, heavy, endless minutes. Then, silently, the creature dissolved into the mist, its form fading like frost touched by warm breath. The mist receded with it, slipping back into the forests as though drawn by invisible threads. For a long time, no one spoke. When at last the ranger found his voice, it was barely more than a whisper. "What was it?" Jaren Marsh answered, with a heaviness that seemed to settle on his shoulders like fresh snow. "Another." The word felt strange on his tongue, as though cracking open a long-forgotten part of the world. The younger brothers stared at him, wide-eyed, disbelieving. "They're real," one murmured. "The tales, they were true?" Jaren nodded slowly. "All of them. The wall holds their memory. And now..." He looked north again, where the mist had vanished into the dark. Now the memory stirs. The brothers remained atop the wall long after the creature had gone, scanning the horizon for any sign of its return. The wind whispered around them like an ancient warning. When dawn finally broke, pale and thin, the ranger patrols were doubled. The Lord Commander convened every officer. The gates were reinforced. Every dragon-glass blade was sharpened. Old journals were opened, old maps consulted, and stories once dismissed as lore were studied with new, fearful eyes. Word spread through Castle Black like fire catching in dry wood. The cold ones have returned. The ancient enemy wakes. The long night may come again. But even in their fear, the brothers felt something else stir within them. Purpose, the vow they had spoken, sometimes bitterly, sometimes reluctantly, now wrapped around their hearts like a cloak. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. These words were no longer ritual. They were truth. They were necessity. For the wall existed for this very moment. The watch existed for this very enemy. Though they were few now, fewer than in any age before, they stood upon the ancient ice with a spark of determination burning quietly behind their eyes. Something had awakened beyond the wall, but the watch had awakened too. And as the sky darkened once more, the brothers took their places. Torches flickered in the gloom. Steel gleamed. Dragon glass was fastened to belts. The night's watch, diminished and forgotten by the world, stood ready for a threat older than memory itself. The wall waited. The brothers watched. And in the silent, endless snow, the first breath of a new long night unfurled across the frozen north.